Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Transformers Foundation panel. We've got everyone here. I think, Andre, we can't see you. Can you turn on your video? Nice. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. I think I'm going to give a brief introduction. I think that many of the people who are here today were also here for our session in November. This is a part 2 of a conversation, but if you weren't, fear not. This conversation will still be relevant and interesting to you. And if in case you weren't, I'm going to give a short introduction to Transformers Foundation and also to part 1 of this conversation back in November. And as I do that, I'm also going to introduce our guests here, or reintroduce, I should say, our guests here today. But I'm really looking forward to this conversation because back in November, it was a very lively chat. And I had the impression we had the chance to just barely scratch the surface of the things that we wanted to get into. So for context, Transformers Foundation, if you haven't heard, we are the unified voice of the denim supply chain. We were founded in 2020, and every year we do a deep dive report on a theme or a topic that matters to our community. And in 2023? In 2022, our report was on chemical certification schemes and the sort of complexity and chaos that chemical certification schemes are causing to suppliers in the denim supply chain and beyond. And Dr. Siva Pariti, who's here with us today and is the Senior Technical Marketing Director at STS BluWin, was interviewed for that report and quite involved in it and has lots of experience in the chemical certification space. The report was written, for context, by Alden Wicker, who is an award-winning journalist and the founder of EcoCult. And as I mentioned, it documents the lack of alignment of chemical management rules, the lack of the impact that has on the denim supply chain and the proliferation of standards, the money and the work that it takes for the supply chain to comply, fraud and ineffectiveness. And, you know, I'm not a chemical person myself, in fact, hate chemistry. And as I was reading this report, I couldn't help but think, you know, this same report could have been written about social compliance standards. It could have been written about materials certifications, and that a lot of the issues that we found in our report had parallels with conversations happening in other, let's say, spaces in the sustainable fashion conversation, whether it's social compliance, material certifications. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to get these people who are having these conversations in these different spaces together and to see if we can have a conversation more generally about certifications. What are the parallels between the challenges that we see? What are the parallels potentially in terms of the solutions that might be worth exploring? So that was what we did in November, at the end of November. And as I mentioned, this is a follow-up to that webinar because there was so much to say and so much positive feedback that we thought we had to do a part 2. So I've already introduced Dr. Siva Pariti. I want to introduce the rest of our panelists today. We have Aruna Kashyap, the Associate Director in Economic Justice and Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. She's also the author of a new report, which I think has a great title. It's called Obsessed with the Audit Tools, Missing the Goal. So if you haven't seen that, be sure to go and check it out. We also have Crispin Argento of Fibretrace and Andre Raghu, CEO of Hira Partner or HAP International. So I want to get right into it so that we have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A at the end. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And as I said, we'll come to them towards the end of the conversation. Okay, so let's get into it. In our last discussion in November, albeit in sort of different ways, something that I heard from each of you was that certifications and audits are not driving impact. And I think that there's a lot of people in the industry that agree with this. But what I'm sort of curious about is, like, if there's so much consensus around this point, or maybe you disagree that there isn't that much consensus, also a valid point of view. But if there's consensus around this, why do we keep doing certifications? You know, what are certifications for? Who are they for? And Andre, I want to actually have you start the conversation, because I heard you say in another panel recently at Kingpins in New York, you called the myth of certification. You said like you would title a book, "The Myth of Certification: Shattered Dreams," and see if you would be willing to elaborate on that statement and give your perspective on why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep doing these certifications?
Thank you, Kim. And first, before we begin, I just want to again thank you as well as the Transformers group in creating a safe space for these sorts of conversations. I think one of the most important aspects of being able to get to the question you're asking is to be able to talk about it, and for people to be willing to kind of focus in on issues that are what I would say uncomfortable issues to discuss. And so from my vantage point and why I made that comment, which was probably part sarcastic, but sort of a bit brow raising at the same time, was that, you know, it's still very unclear who the parties are that benefit from the certification system. And I think the issue sort of starts from there, right? Without a clear understanding of who the beneficiaries are, you sort of end up in this conundrum that's, you know, kind of ever evolving, where you're not quite certain what the goals are of the certification system. And the paradox that we see is the reliance, the sort of continued reliance on a broken certification system due to a sort of a lack of alternatives, puts you in a sort of situation where the person commissioning the audits, you know, always seems to be sort of on the good side of the stick, but the people that are the subject of the audits end up to be the ones that are most in question, right? And so when we kind of look at this issue, you know, we believe it continues because there's not really a lack of clarity around what the system is or what it should achieve or what the goals are. And one of the big policy arguments we've been making in terms of reform is the need to identify the industry as a public interest industry, right? That's something that hasn't been done, but it's a parallel that would make a lot of sense because a lot of the arguments, you know, related to the industry have to do with public interest related issues, right? Whether they're disclosures or transparency or impact and that sort of thing. And so we can talk a bit more about that, but that was the sort of core of where I was coming from with the comment.
Can I put like a very, maybe it's stupid or too obvious question on the table, but when you say it's not clear, there's sort of two parts. Like you mentioned, who are the parties that benefit, but then also lack of clarity about what the goals are. And isn't the goal very simple? Isn't the goal to make sure that people on the production floor are, you know, and that's why I said maybe this is naive, but isn't the goal to make sure that people involved in making a product are you know, are earning a decent living and with dignity?
I think most people, particularly consumers or the average person, would interpret that as being the reason we're doing all these things. And I think that's a very reasonable response from everyone, what you're saying, but it's not necessarily the reality, right, of what's happening in terms of the methodologies, the approaches. You know, we have been asking the question, you know, now for 20 plus years as to what the intention is of the audits in many places. And it's never quite clear, right, from responsible business initiative to another, you know, from brand to brand. There's quite a large diversity of what people are actually doing. And so if there's not an understanding of what the intention is, then it makes you kind of get to the responses that you're talking about. And you can understand where the confusion comes from, is because the average consumer is kind of looking at this issue as one that they assume that it is all about protection of workers. But in a lot of cases, it could be about risk management. It could be about risk aversion. It could be about, plausible deniability. It could be about, and also it could also be about protecting workers. I'm not suggesting that every case is not that, but certainly if you kind of look across the industry and you were to take a poll, you would not find a consistent response as to what the intention is. And so, I always say that, when I look at these programs, it almost seems the one commissioning the audit, they kind of view their role in this industry as a courtesy, right? But the people who are the subject of the audits, or even the auditors themselves, you kind of look at them through a lens of presumption, right? And that presumption is always, kind of something bad is happening, right? Or someone is not, needed in the process. But in terms of the courtesy side, it's always from the lens of, hey, we're doing the best we can, sort of thing. But that is not necessarily connecting the dots where they need to be.
Thank you. Aruna, I want to ask you on this question next, because as I mentioned, your report is called Obsessed with the Audit Tools, Missing the Goal. And what's your take on this? Who are certifications for? Why do we keep doing them?
So, thanks again. And I want to once again thank you and Transformers Foundation for inviting us and organizing this very engaging panel. And also looking forward to hearing from our listeners and viewers. And I'm going to give you two answers. One is an answer that an auditor gave me in one of our conversations, where we were discussing, okay, this is, someone who's been in the industry for at least over a decade, first as sort of a, did a slightly different role as a consultant and then became an auditor. So knows all of the tricks of the trade, as it were. And he provided quite an interesting insight, which was it's a win-win-win, where it was what he described was that it was a win for the buyer, it was a win for the supplier, and a win for the auditor. So what he was saying is he manages his work in such a way that he can check off a few things on every side, and that was his perspective. And that was part of the story, because he was also fairly frustrated from being in the industry and doing the work, because he felt like a lot of the pressure that was put on suppliers was also not within the auditor's mandate. So, we've talked about this previously. So, for example, a lot of things around purchasing practices, the pressure put on suppliers, et cetera, is completely outside of the remit of what a certification system or the social audit system would pick up, and in some ways quite difficult for this system to pick up, because if you sit with a supplier and ask them to name specific brands, they're not going to do that because of the huge commercial ramifications for them. So I think, and if you speak with civil society, there's a lot of a different kind of audit fatigue, if I might call it that, right? We a lot of civil society will be like, this is tried and tested. Certification systems have been tested for years and decades, and it's not driving the kind of impact we want to see. So why does the system continue? And I think in some ways, and this is, and I'm going to put these in things and insights from what I've heard from people from within the industry. So it's not just, okay, human rights, we have a perspective on this, but I also want to tell you the kind of perspectives like you hear from within the industry itself, which is, it allows business to continue. So it's not the most robust approach to due diligence or human rights due diligence, which is what we'd be interested in. It's sort of a generation, like you sort of generate paper which allows what Andre was saying. It also gives you plausible deniability. It gives you lots of different things, allows you to do something in every different place without it necessarily being tailored to very specific risks, that allows business to continue. And once one CSR representative was very interesting. One CSR representative was talking to me also from the audit industry, so had done a lot of audits himself, but sort of then moved on to do head the CSR department of a brand, was saying, the trick to this industry, he's saying, is mediocrity. And that was a very telling, sad statement, he was like, the way to write the audit report is you don't put anything too bad and you don't put anything too good, so it doesn't draw anybody's attention, right? So for as long as we approach human rights due diligence with that kind of approach of business continuity, where even if your stated goal somewhere is worker rights protection, but it sort of just gets sidelined in the process where business continuity becomes the most important thing, I think that becomes a problem. For civil society, for human rights organizations, for Human Rights Watch, then we begin to question the robustness of this approach, right? And we can go on to what, so if not this, then what else? So I think there needs to be a very, I think that's the primary motive in some ways. And of course, I won't paint every single social audit the same way, but I think for the vast majority of them, and at least the ones that I've seen, would begin to question, the quality of the audit. And I've seen quite a number of them, like actual reports. So.
Thank you. Crispin, I see you want to respond, and then Dr. Siva, I will turn to you.
Yeah, I think it's, thanks for all these comments. I think it's really interesting. I think, you asked the question, what are the purpose of these certifications? And I think we really have to go back, and I spoke about this in November, to the genesis of why this whole system was constructed in the first place. And I think Andre said it was about risk. It's about risk management, right? Reputation and risk management. Look, I have an insurance on my house. I have insurance on my car. I have insurance on my life, right? Because I'm assessing statistical risk, right, in my life. Now, if I'm a smoker, my life insurance is going to go increase. If I'm driving drunk all the time and I'm getting in accidents, my insurance of my car is going to increase. If my house has flood insurance and it's built on a floodplain, my house effectively is covered from a liability standpoint based on statistical risk, right? And I'm only taking this out of the context because I think we get mired in all these details. Well, auditors are doing this and certifications are doing this. The system was never designed for real impact. The system was designed as an insurance policy. And so we need to really shift, because what we're now seeing in the global trade system, not just in apparel, but all across all CPG products, textiles and fabrics and textile and our industry included, is we're now shifting from an era of statistical risk assessment to true materiality risk. So we need to actually just transition from certifications being, okay, this is what we're doing. We all need to have these insurance policies in place, but we need to shift to real materiality assessment and how that impacts trade, how that impacts our ability to secure goods, sell goods, and deliver real value to consumers, which is the purpose of this industry, as far as I'm concerned, right? And so I just, to kind of shift the conversation a little bit, if we can just accept the fact that the certification scheme has all been about risk insurance, about statistical risk management, and we shift to another form, what does that look like? That's the question that I often have, and we explore at Fibretrace. What is understanding real material risk in the value chain? And of course, from the traceability perspective, how do we identify that risk? And then how do we intervene in managing that risk? Because we now know that our cotton is coming from Xinjiang, or our cotton is coming from India, or our cotton is coming from Brazil, et cetera, right? So I think that's an important element to really have a little bit of imagination beyond just this existing system that existed for 25 years. And what does the next 25 years look like?
Yeah, and we're going to get into that, I promise. But I want to give Dr. Siva a chance to also weigh in here. What are your thoughts on who are certifications for, and why do we keep doing them?
So to answer this, actually, I pick one each point everyone have emphasized. Who is it for? Basically to ensure the trust, and they want to know what is in there, and they want to know that XYZ is not happening there.
Who's they?
Means the brand, this stakeholder. Basically, there is a risk for the stakeholder. It could be legal, it could be contractual, it could be many things. Even if you take an insurance as an example, I've insured and I'm paying for it. And I know that every year I'm increasing my insurance because of my habits and I'm paying for it. However, at one fine day when I want to claim the insurance because of accident or whatever, then there will be a third party coming in. And then they said, no, you should have done this. Are you driving at that time? Are you in full stake? Whatever. It could be a road or whatever. So I am expected to answer all the exact questions, paying my money. I am paying for it. And when I'm claiming, all the questions will come up. When I'm not claiming, no questions asked, you pay for the insurance again. So there is a claim whenever there is someone. So what is it, the scope? The scope is to see what is happening, or the scope is to see what is not happening. And the problem is that the assessor who is going there, after some point of time, they become somehow they become custodians of their entire these things. Even if there is not there, they wanted to see it. And they imagine things what is not there. Sometimes it is possible that some people are wanting to do it to camouflage things, but then you will see everyone with the same lens. That's the problem. Now, identifying the people who are the culprits from whatever your experience is an art. You can't teach it. You can't just create from a guideline or a documentation or a set of questions. Now, why people are doing it, that also is something which you need to look at. As long as there is no implication, people don't have to do or lie or camouflage or don't have to take any second thoughts or anything like that. Just because there is a liability. If you don't pass that audit, there is a liability. I want to, in that case, I will make sure that I wanted to pass that audit at any cost. And that is the problem. We are not looking at improvement. We are not looking at a positive aspect as an outcome, as what Aruna said. Unless you do not keep something which is really bad and sensationalization in the report, that report is not a report. What did you do? Nothing. Why should I pay for this? This is the answer which people will ask. So that's the reason the auditors also, it's a win-win-win, as I agree with Aruna, because everyone have to have a stake. Okay, I wanted to show that something is not correct. My report is okay. I am done. Mill is telling, okay, only little bit is the problem. We are still okay, business as usual, but we will manage and continuous improvement. They're also happy. Brand is also happy because they have done their job. There is a document based on this, the transaction can happen. So this is how the situation has happened today, not because of improvement, not because of transparency. If the whole scope is transparency and traceability, things would have been different. There are no need of so much of documentation requirement. It could be simple things, but unfortunately, we have become transactional.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm gonna do my best to try and bring us together here. But I hear a lot about risk, right? That certifications are used as a way to protect yourself. Well, let me actually go back a step. As a way for brands and retailers to protect themselves, are used by brands and retailers as a way to protect themselves from the risk of consumers being unhappy with them because their products are being produced in a way that is not okay. You're grimacing. Okay, you want to try, you want to grimace, Crispin, I see. Is that a fair sentence or not a fair sentence?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's consumer. I think it's just general corporate governance. Honestly, it's sure there are the labels that consumers know about, GOTS being one of them in the organic cotton space, maybe fair trade, but there are very few labels that consumers really respond to, and we know those things. Like a consumer doesn't say, oh, this was sewn under a SMETA audit. And
Yeah,
they're like, oh, I
okay.
got to have that t-shirt, right? I think it's more about, it's about reasonable care. It's about corporate governance, managing their own risks for their shareholders or their investors or whatnot, more
Right.
than anything. It's an insurance policy.
So it's a way, certifications are a way for brands and retailers to assure financial institutions that the products that they sell have been made in a certain way. Is that a fair statement?
Manufacturers as well. And in
Okay.
my world, growers, I mean, everybody, like it's
Everybody,
as
yeah,
Aruna said, it's
everyone
everybody. If everybody has insurance, right,
Mm.
effectively, then we can do business together, because if the inevitable, not the inevitable, but if the risk shows itself, then we're all protected. I can build a house on the floodplain, have insurance. It's equivalent to building that same house on top of a mountaintop. If you consider that, you know, I'm only protecting the asset of the house and its value with the insurance, not the fact that there might be lives in that house that are not replaceable, right? Are not, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's insurance. It's to me, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit blunt, but everyone knows me of being a little bit blunt.
Yeah. Andre and Aruna and Dr. Siva, if you want to jump in, please raise your hands.
View of and by the way, Crispin, we appreciate the bluntness. I think that's what makes you special, and we like to talk to you. The opposing view is that when that system of sort of risk management, or if you want to compare it to an insurance policy, is constructed around sort of mechanisms that cannot cannot consistently be relied upon. What you do is you create an environment where it becomes too painful for the truth, right? And so when I look at the certification system and sort of the continuance, I almost feel that it's too painful right now for the certifiers or even the companies involved to be themselves, right? Because now you have 20 plus years of messaging that says, this is what it looks like, and this is how great things are, and so forth. And it doesn't mean that progress hasn't been made, but when the spotlight is in the wrong areas, and we've kind of accentuated the things that are less important and kind of pushed down the things that are more material, and all of a sudden you have this environment of where it's normalized not to be yourself, right? At some point, you're creating the equivalent of a financial balloon in a market, right? At some point, it's going to burst because it's not based on reality, right? And I think a lot of what I think Aruna mentioned in her comments, a lot of what are in a lot of reports, including the one that the Human Rights Watch just issued. It's really giving an indication of, is there a balloon that's about to burst around this industry, right? That's the way I kind of look at it. And so if you are kind of connected to this industry, as a certifier, as a person that is a beneficiary of it, or what have you, it puts you in a very painful position, right? And one of the ways that we see or a path forward is really around different forms of transparency that are not necessarily just based on disclosures of supplier lists and things like that, but transparency around what are you doing, right? what are actually the attributes that make up what you believe is responsible behavior, responsible conduct, things like that. I think the closer we can get to being specific provides a path forward to greater understanding, greater clarity, greater acceptance. It's not that these things need to go away, or I think I remember reading in your report, Aruna, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, but you used the terminology of a smart mix of tools. And I think this is absolutely right. You do need a smart mix of tools. So it's not we're not looking at this as a damning process of the certification industry. What I think the lens should be is that, it's time to get on with it, right? We need policies, methodologies, and things that get us closer to addressing the systemic issues that are in the industry. They can no longer be buried, right? Because all that's doing is it's creating this pit of lack of credibility that sooner or later won't be able to sort of be climbed out of. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's a real need for inclusive thought, right, in this industry, because one of the other things you can see is that there's not an even distribution of inclusive thought. And so if you have the same types of people gathering, formulating the same sorts of ideas, then you can kind of also understand why the industry continues in the same pattern, right? And the supply chain does not look one way, right? The workers in the factories don't look one way. The management, the supervisors, all the way to the people at the end of the cycle. And so we do need the ability to have a more even distribution of the thought process that goes into reform of these systems if we want to.
Yeah, I want to, okay, I think jump in if I've got it wildly wrong, but I sense like sort of consensus that certifications are, the reason we keep doing them is because they sort of keep business running, right? I think that's what those are your exact or close to exact words, Aruna, and maybe Crispin. This is also what you're driving at with the insurance policy. And Dr. Siva and Andre, I think you've spoken to this as well in your own ways, and that the reason they keep business running is because they offer a sort of kind of assurance and security in a very uncertain and unassured operating environment at its sort of most fundamental. But what I've been thinking about, or I think if we then sort of pivot and look at like, okay, well, what should we do instead? I think the conversation about alternatives to certifications often starts with, okay, so what's a better way to give people this assurance? Whether it's to financial institutions or indirectly to consumers, who, as part of sort of keeping market share. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is, in our chemical report, and this is maybe a little bit long-winded, but I'm going to do it anyway against my better judgment. But one of the things that we have been that we wrote about, or that Alden wrote about in the chemical report that we released last year, is how these certifications are being leveraged as market differentiator. My sustainability is better than yours, and there's various attempts in different spaces, material, chemical, social, around global convergence, and how do we align around a single set of standards. But what I'm sort of wondering on like a more fundamental level is, does it make sense to be competing on sustainability? And, we all say that this is a systemic problem, and a systemic problem is, I think, by definition, something that no individual actor can solve alone. And so I just sort of keep I'm going to share two quotes that I keep sort of coming back to, and that sort of, for me, like, make me think about, okay, when we talk about, we agree that certifications are about, providing assurance to keep business as usual running. We agree that they're not working. So then what would be a different way to provide that assurance? But is that the right question to be asking? Is assurance the goal, so to speak, or should that be the goal? And the two quotes are, and I the first one is one I share a lot. So if you've heard me say it before, apologies, but it's an anecdote from a book written by Otto Scharmer. And he describes a restaurant in Philadelphia whose owner, Judy Wicks, spent 25 years pioneering sustainable business practices. And he quotes her as saying, I realized there is no such thing as one sustainable business, no matter how good the practices were within my company, no matter if I composted and recycled and bought from farmers and used renewable energy and so on. I had to go outside of my own company and start working in cooperation with others, particularly with my competitors, to build a whole new system based on those values. And somebody else, a colleague who works on the manufacturing side, this is the second quote, recently reflected on LinkedIn. His name is Dr. Vidura Ralapanawa, and he said, let me say this again. This is his quote. Let me say this again. As a corporate sustainability practitioner who championed corporate climate goals, I support strong individual corporate action. Yet by trying to outdo each other on climate action, or fill in here other types of certifications, we lose our ability to be effective in collective action, and we will collectively fail too. And so my question is sort of, should the conversation about alternatives be jumping right into, well, what's a different way to provide this assurance? Or should we be sort of taking a step back and saying, well, is assurance the right goal, the right place to focus? Or do we need to sort of redefine that? I hope that's clear. I know it was long-winded. Yes, you're nodding. Does anyone want to take a stab at it first?
To start
Well,
with,
I mean,
Kim,
Yeah, Aruna,
sorry.
let you go ahead, and then
Aruna,
Dr.
go ahead.
Siva.
Sorry, I really like, two thoughts on collective action. I think I'm going to pick up on a point that was already made. The one question I would ask companies internally and for departments, including purchasing departments, is, are you regulation ready? Because there is a growing spurt of regulation around the world. And so the question is, are you regulation ready? And how do you show, or how do you prepare for regulation that's coming? And in order to do that, there is no substitute except to have a smart mix of tools. So the first thing, for example, when I am talking to companies, is you want to show that if you say collaborative action is necessary, then you have to create the grounds for collaboration. And you don't create the grounds for collaboration if you're not transparent about your supply chain. So traceability and transparency is really important. And you can't be part of one system talking only within that system, because that may not be the same set of companies sourcing from that particular place. So you have to be transparent. You also want to collaborate with civil society, with worker rights organizations, environmental organizations, and so on. So one way to indicate that you're collaboration ready is to be transparent about your supply chain. And you can be part of initiatives like the Open Supply Hub. They were the Open Apparel registry, which is now turned into the Open Supply Hub. Look them up, join them, indicate your collaboration ready. The second thing is, to the second quote, I completely agree. Again, this goes to, is the company thinking of sustainability purely in terms of reputational risks? Or is it genuinely thinking about what it brings to the table for workers? Now, if a company is approaching, let's say, grievance redress as something that's genuinely worker-centric, you're not going to go down the path of, if there is a country where another company has created a good system, or 3 other companies have come together, you're not going to create your own separate system and have your own brand logo on it merely because you want another system created, which then sets up the my hotline versus your hotline, right? If there is a system and it's working well, and you can see that it's working well, join it. And two examples, right? For example, on health and safety, the Bangladesh Accord in Bangladesh, now expanding to Pakistan. So if there is an existing system proven to be robust, credible, join it. Don't create a separate competing other initiative merely because you want your logo slapped on it, because it may make the company look good, but does it genuinely benefit workers? And for people and for organizations working on the ground, actually helping workers, it is near impossible to educate a worker on 20 different types of brand hotlines that they should remember. If you're on this day producing for this brand, make sure it's this hotline. If it's this other brand, remember it's this hotline, and have a big paraphernalia of, you need a directory of hotlines sitting in the front, the frontline responder, which is not practical. So a brand sitting over here, we understand that if you're sitting somewhere else in Europe, it is not possible for you to know in every single country what exactly is going on. But that's why collaboration is key, and having individual brand action, while it's really important, is not going to get you a long way. So I would say, if you want to be regulation ready, then you have to be also pro-collaboration in ways that are pre-competitive, and that's proven to happen. And one way to, and there are 2-3 ways in which to do it, but grievance redress and supply chain transparency, I would say, are just absolutely central.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, Crispin, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Dr. Siva, maybe you were going to speak.
No,
but
I can.
You know,
I can go after you. You are
something
hot.
you said, Aruna, that struck me as interesting is, you know, we can go in this mantra while we're joining this multi-stakeholder platform in a pre-competitive nature, and that's nice from the brand's perspective and maybe some of the suppliers that are allowed in the door, right? But if we actually shift it and we say, who are the actual practitioners of certification, it's highly competitive certification bodies and NGOs in the space that are competing. If they're not competing for commercial dollars, they're competing for grant money, right? There's only so much. And they, and on the, in the commercial space, it's like we've got 1,000 different flavors of ice cream of social audits in the world. They're all based on the ILO principles. If you really dumb it down, yeah, there's nuance here, there's nuance there, there's methodology there that are different. And there are certainly others whose business models are better than others out there. We know that. I don't know much about the social, you know, compliance world. I rely on you folks to do that. But it's the same thing in the fiber space. I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking at the same underlying principles, but they're all taking different flavors of ice cream, right? In terms of how it's communicated. And I think the fundamental problem is this, is that we brought sustainability to consumers and we look at sustainability as a differentiator. One of my favorite new terms that I've seen on LinkedIn and had conversations with people is called green hushing. You guys may have seen it. It's this new little buzzword that's out there. And I'm like, thank goodness, I love green hushing. Just do your work, put your head down and actually make real material impact in your value chain to secure your business, to make sure you don't go out of business, and make sure you still have employees that want to work for you next year and the year after that and the year after that. We don't need to tell consumers. I am not a conscious consumer. I've been in this space for 15 years. When I go out and buy a pair of jeans, I don't care. I like the price, I like the color, I like the fit, and I don't care if it has a label on it. And so we've completely undermined the sustainability intentions. And if you really want to go back to the Brundtland Commission, and the whole thing was about risk of a manufacturer that, look, we have strong headwinds of environmental catastrophe, of political unrest, of all of these things that are continuing to push on the textile value chain, yet we continue just to pretend that none of those things really actually exist, right? And we just certify this, certify that, certify this, certify that, look at this logo, look at that logo. And I think we really need to truly go beyond that, because like I said when we began, it's no longer about statistical risk. The statistics are out. The statistics are half of the cotton crop in Pakistan disappeared because of climate change. That's pretty compelling. It's now about material risk. I'm buying my jeans from Pakistan and I no longer can get cotton to make my jeans. How do I manage that from a supply chain perspective, right? So I think that we really need to, like, we've got to stop pretending. We've got to stop taking, you know, what I refer to as the blue pill, which is milk, honey, and denial. And we started to really take the red pill, which is enlightenment and truth and knowledge and wisdom, so that we can actually protect our business. Sustainability isn't about saving the planet. It's about saving this industry, period. We don't need any more t-shirts. That in their quote you gave, we're not sustainable. The most sustainable thing you can do, and I tell this to brands all the time, go out of business. However, you employ a lot of really smart people and cool people that are doing cool things for consumers that want your product. So that's a beautiful thing. But how do you continue to do that in the future if you're not manning the shop in the sense of taking care of your supply chain and making sure that they can actually deliver the products that you need that make you money as a business? Think about the catastrophe that, you know, we're still reeling from with COVID. We have no product. There's been just this ebb and flow of things, and we're just buying time, and that's it. Sorry.
No need to apologize. I want to make sure there's time for questions. And so I know not all of you have had a chance to answer that question. I'm going to put one more question on the table, and you can, Dr. Siva and Andre, you can take your pick, which one you want to take. If you want to continue the discussion we've just been having, or The last question that I really wanted to put on the table for discussion today is, if you had a blank, and Crispin, I think, is starting to allude to this, but if you had a blank slate, room for total imagination, what do you want fashion supply chains to look like in 25 years? And how do certifications fit or not fit into that picture? Because, and the sort of context for that question is, I think the sentiment I sense from all of you is sort of fear that if we continue with certification business as usual or tweaks around the edges, we'll still be having the same conversation in 25 years. So Andre and Dr. Siva, I give you a chance to answer, and then Aruna and Crispin, you'll have a chance for closing thoughts. And I'm going to ask you to really try and keep it brief so that we can have 10 minutes for questions at the end.
If we have the choice and we start from the beginning, to start with, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that someone wants to start with? So if the aspirations and requests are very clear, the problem with the certifications and the certifications origin also is, as we are moving forward, our ask started increasingly diverse. They started increasing and they'd become diversified. Therefore, we started creating one more standard, one more certification, one more certification. This will only cover this will cover only those aspects. This will go deep into the life cycle. This will not go into the life cycle because it is only this much, and all that. The reason for that is we did not start writing down all the asks, what I want a certification looks like. Once that is done.
So who should do that?
I think all the brands, like, for example, it has been a constant ask why there is no one RSL, because RSL will not be one because the place of operation is not same. Like Walmart is only in US, Nike is in 150 countries. They both can't have one single ask.
Yeah.
Because all countries are not asking the same thing. Now, somehow someone needs to sit aside and say, go beyond the regulatory, because if it is regulatory, I understand everyone will fall in place. Now, unfortunately, all countries do not agree, even in UN. So even if the UN has created a charter, they don't adopt. So the adoption is adopted also, they don't even regulate. They don't even roll out. If they roll out, they don't implement. If they implement, they don't monitor. If they monitor, they don't track. If they track, they don't check and police it. So there is so much of diversity there. So let's clearly create one wish list and then ask ourselves, is it really needed? And what is it for? Once that is clear, the certification is very clear. The certifications, people who are out there, they're smart auditors. Not everyone are bad. So those people can create what to ask, how to ask, and not to impose so many difficult situations to everyone. Then we need to train people. Because if we do not train people, we will then start thinking about how to manage. The moment if you do how to manage thing coming in, then
so
things
it's something
will change.
about that we need to have consensus and alignment within the industry about the impact that we want to have.
Yes.
Fair?
Yes.
Okay.
To start with,
as a starting point, and then the tools will follow.
Yeah.
Andre.
Yes. Great. Circle back. I just want to caution all of us just to, I've heard for years comparisons to these industries as we're going to do the same as the financial industry, or we're going to do, Crispin gave the example of the insurance industry. The caution I want to give, in particular, like for example, insurance, right? There is an underwriting process, right, that looks at the risk of what's taking place. And also, when there is gross failure or gross negligence, there's a payout, right? It doesn't exist in this industry. Right? When someone is harmed by the results of these systems, there is no accountability or liability. And I think that's one of the most important things we need to bear in mind when we draw comparisons to other industries that do have those accountability measures in place, because I believe Dr. Siva kind of mentioned it very early in this dialogue. When you have liability and you have accountability, you have also changes in behavior. When you have the absence, you have the parallel behavior, right? People move and act in a way that they understand that there is not really going to be a level of accountability. And from my perspective, and kind of, in these conversations across the industry, I believe one of the most important things we can do beyond looking at tools and all these sorts of things is really to stop the ability to capitalize off the messiness, right? I think you're absolutely correct that this is not a competitive issue, but we also should not create volumes of paper that make it an opportunity issue. And what I can see is that, I'm always receiving policy binders of policies from people about how they're addressing something, but I cannot understand how the methodologies connected with those papers that say all the right things actually connect to any of the issues that we're talking about on the ground, right? And so I almost feel that, other than a smart mix of tools, we have to take a step back and we have to actually think very carefully about redefining language, redefining what policy really is, and making sure that those policies focus on the right types of issues. Or else what you're doing is creating, or what we collectively are doing, is creating this environment where it's very attractive to capitalize off of the messiness. It's also lucrative to capitalize off of the messiness. And so what we are really encouraging is this sort of step back approach that looks at more diversity and thought leadership, right? That looks at the linking of an agenda that has to do with methodologies that are not just more volumes of paper, but methodologies that actually link to issues that need to be resolved, that need to be tackled, right? Agendas that are clear and that are specific. And then, to some extent, re-examining the need to put a piece of paper on the wall and really looking at being able to define a menu of attributes that kind of define what you're actually doing that represents what you would consider to be responsible behavior in these particular areas, right? And so much more of an attribute sort of focus than a certification focus. And then sort of lastly, there needs to be a public interest decision by the industry, right? Because many of the things that are spoken about, not just within this panel, but in a broader context, all can tie back to a viewpoint that the intention of these systems and the methodologies and the tools are to do something that is protection of workers. But if you look, and I'll just give a couple quick examples, if you look at how they operate in different places, if you look at the most recent lawsuits, what are the claims from the defendants? Well, this was never intended to protect workers, right? If you look at the public disclosures and sustainability reports and CSR reports and things like that, none of them come with a list of all the disclosures that are on the back of the audit report that tells the person reading it, oh, by the way, this is all the fine print that you need to be aware of. It just kind of gives you the data. When you talk to the auditors themselves and they say, well, look, 40% of what I'm doing, I don't even know if I can rely on it. I never had the time to really check any of this. And so when you kind of take that and then you tie it to the fact that most training systems have challenges in these more, sensitive issues that require more time during the audit. And you're like, well, wait a minute, training is suffering in really critical areas, but the audit itself doesn't even sort of tackle 40% of what we think is really happening. It just kind of makes you think that we're not focusing on the right things, right? And so my view is really a step back approach, but not a step into trying to replicate what we think are happening in other industries, but to make sure that we understand what people are telling us.
Thank you. Aruna, final thoughts, and then we'll open for questions.
I'll say just two things. One is I'm hoping in 25 years we'll have a critical number of companies that are reach a level of leadership maturity where they don't think of risk management and risk assessments purely in terms of legal terms and reputation terms, but actually think of workers, climate, planet, like genuinely put that at the center and develop a system around it. And second, have more advanced mechanisms in place that is not one size fits all. Because I think the trap now is you take one system and then, let's say, okay, you've identified you want to be part of one certification scheme or things, but regardless of which country or what context or what issue, you take the same thing and you apply it everywhere. So, and that sort of gives you some ability to say, okay, I've done something somewhere. And again, I think people in the know, people who are involved deeply in helping companies design these systems don't find that approach helpful to companies. In fact, it's the contrary. It's like you're not mitigating your risks at all by doing that. You're doing the opposite because it's only going to take some time for someone to catch on to that. So I think it has to be genuinely risk-based and have a smart mix. And I think in that smart mix, you have to be collaboration ready and be prepared to be transparent in meaningful ways. And one of them is supply chain transparency. But also, I think the companies that are more radically transparent are genuinely better. At least they're able to demonstrate with a lot of information or what the source of information is. And I think that's key.
I kind of wonder, yeah. All right. I have approval. I have approval from Annie to go 5 minutes over, if that's all right with you guys. Is that okay with you guys? Okay.
I think what we're all talking about here collectively is trust.
Well, can I add to that? Because what I kind of wonder if the thing that we're all talking about collectively, fundamentally, is about restructuring how rethinking how we structure our supply chains. Because what you're talking about like in terms of, Aruna, that you can't have a one size fits all approach. Okay, well, that requires probably working then with fewer partners, knowing who those partners are, and really being able to come up with an approach that makes sense in the context that they're operating in. Or, we're talking about transparency. Well, transparency would be a lot easier if you knew the people involved in your supply chain, and
or
so that's
transparency wasn't a liability for you. I know a lot of suppliers that they'll say, look, if I'm transparent about what we're doing, I'm going to lose business.
Yes.
Right. That's because we still have a very much of a cat and mouse colonial approach to these things. I know a lot of suppliers who will tell me on one side, yeah, I've got a lot of certificates in blah, blah, blah cotton, and I'm selling these guys conventional because that's what they want. And I'm going to sell them the piece of paper because that's what they want, knowing full well that they don't have that because they're afraid of what the punitive actions of their buyers and ultimately the brands will have on their business. So we have to build trust, right?
I want to pull some questions from the audience. So I'm looking at the chat box, and the first question is, why should we dig back when we buy from a certified source, which of course was evaluated in terms of documentation and traceability? Why should I take all the way back? Do you mean from a traceability perspective, Mohammed? The questions from Mohammed El Hindi. I'm gonna give him a chance to answer that. I'm gonna go to the next question. When you speak about, this is a question from Hank Gilhouse, and it says, when you speak about the industry in quotations, you are referring to the audit certification standard setting industry, or is it about a particular sector, the fashion industry, for instance? And I think that, Crispin, this is maybe a question for you.
Well, these systems don't just exist for the fashion industry. These are, I think that they're glaringly flawed in the fashion industry more than other industries, but these labor standards go across industries. Same with chemical standards, same to some extent with material standards. But I think ultimately what we're talking about is the, again, this is a controversial term, but is the certification industrial complex that has been developed over the last 25 years and has led to an entire industry of itself that isn't actually levering change in the industry in which it was designed to do, or at least intended, as Andre would say.
Thank you. There's another question in this chat, which is, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. It's from Aminur Rahman. And what I sort of take from this question is that basically it's not so easy to know from a brand's perspective what should be done. And so my question for this group is, okay, if you could say, in a sentence, what do you think? And maybe Aruna, this is like the smart mix of tools that you've been talking about, but what should a brand do? How would you answer that? Does anyone want to take that question? If you were to give advice or to say to a brand what they should do instead?
Start with intent.
Start with intent.
That's, I think, if you start with intent, you will start to shape something that is explainable and understandable to the people or the stakeholders that you're engaging with. And again, kind of circling back, if your intention is not clear and what you're doing is kind of riding the wave of the messiness and sort of, capitalizing on messaging opportunities, where it sort of fits in, that's where things get very opaque for everyone, right? They're not quite clear. And then these questions of impact come up. And one thing I want to say is we've worked with lots of brands that do create impact in different areas, but it's all part of like a wider sort of ecosystem of clutter, right? And so you almost have to pick apart what things are creating impact versus other things that are just things that are happening, but they're not necessarily driving. But when you start to kind of connect them with what you wanted to achieve, what you started out wanting to do, the picture becomes very clear for everyone inside and out.
Andre, there's a question just following up on that in the chat box, which is, are SDGs the wish list? When you say start with intent, is it the SDGs? Do we already have it in front of us?
Well, in my mind, what SDGs give is they provide very good goals. I think they provide sort of thought leadership of where you want to go. But you need to take those sorts of things back inside the organization and say, what do we want to do? What is it that we want to achieve, right? And are our goals a path that's going to take us toward doing X, or is it going to take us toward doing Y? And that question is very personal, I believe, for each and every company.
Yeah. I mean, why do we continue to look at the brands as the savers of the fashion industry? I think after the last 15 years of being in this industry, I tend to actually say, look, it's the responsibility of the suppliers. The brands are really good at buying product, just like consumers are, and selling that product for a higher price to consumers. They're marketing agencies or marketing companies that happen to make t-shirts, jeans, and footwear, right? It's the suppliers that hold the keys to human dignity, sustainability, because they're the ones that understand labor. They know what an SAM is in terms of labor, right? That amount of time it takes to make a product, right? This is dorky stuff. They understand yarn, they understand fabric, they understand cotton, they understand fiber. They are the ones that are empowered to actually engineer the shift.
Yeah.
Brands don't have the capacity oftentimes to do that, but we're often point the finger to brands, you should do this. Well, a brand paying $1.05 for a t-shirt doesn't know that you can't produce that t-shirt for $1.05 because the supplier in anywhere Asia says, sure, we'll make it for you for $1.05, even though we know it's below our cost of goods. That is unethical. Unless there's a strategic reason, right? It's a lost leader. But at the end of the day, you set that precedent. The brands will expect $1.05, and the next year they'll expect $1.03 because they don't understand that the cost of the cotton in that product alone is $1.20. And then the labor is like, well, there's no accountability for the labor or anything else, right? So we really have to understand the fundamentals of the trade And that, I think, is the responsibility of a lot of the suppliers. And we're not stepping up because the suppliers have been conditioned to just be yes men to the brands. And we need to shift that dialogue a little bit, I think. Maybe that's controversial.
Well, it sort of gets at the heart of, what Transformers Foundation is all about. And, at Transformers Foundation, we believe that transformational change starts with producers. However, producers also can't do it alone. And that, I think, is the piece is, how, if producers are the one, and for me, it's an open question, but if producers are the ones who have to drive this change, then how can everybody else who's in this picture be an ally? And for me, that's a bit of an open question.
Sorry,
yeah, please. Last burning thought.
Sorry, and I just want to come in on that. I think in terms of what brands can do to drive at, Crispin was touching on a crucial aspect, ethical business, and literally we can go on for hours. And I think suppliers have a role. But I think brands have to create the environment for suppliers to provide them candid feedback on what costing looks like, right? And I've sat with suppliers who say to me, want them to roll out a costing tool for living wages. When they show them the cost, they're not interested. So I mean, it comes back to how. So in terms of what can you do differently, and in the intentionality aspect, I think it has to start from brand conduct too. Like, how much are you willing to support a certain kind of ethical production when it comes down to even costs? And I think that's also something that has to be part of due diligence and prep for regulation.
And this comes back to the conversation about how do we structure our supply chains, because
but then structuring our supply chain or creating impact to the supply chain, because
structuring our supply chains in a way that will have impact.
But still there will be some people who are good at what they do, and there are many people who will say, yes, whatever you say, sir, I will do it for you.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. So when Aruna mentioned one important word, maturity. So that maturity and leadership is what we need to inculcate and get the supply chain to improve upon and create a level playing field for everyone. That's when you will have equality, and then you will say all the rules will play for the system. Otherwise, these rules are made for only work for someone else, and all others are deprived.
I'm getting messages. I've got to close this session. I'm really sorry.
Number three.
Yeah, I think I have a feeling we could go on for a long time, but I think these conversations are needed. So I just want to thank all of you, because I know the to-do lists are never ending. And I want to thank you guys, the panelists, for taking time out of your day to have an open-ended conversation that crosses exactly 0 things off of anybody's to-do list. And I want to thank the people who have joined today for doing the same, because I think the only way that we will get out of this situation is if we make more time for these kinds of conversations. So I really appreciate it. And who knows, maybe we'll do another one. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days, whether they're starting or ending. And I hope to see you again soon.